Rifles to roses, ramparts remember. And now for a tale from our travels that particularly tickled our sense of the absurd. This is Chapter 7, Rifles to Roses, Ramparts Remember, where we found Ponta Delgada trading wartime strategies for surprising symbols of peace right after we managed to sort out our rental car. You might say a historic fort taught us less about firepower than about flower power. Let's just say things got interesting. Rental return, road rhythms and relaxed rates. After wrestling with transatlantic flights, baffling rental car technology, and the creeping onset of the vacation sniffles, you might ask, what constitutes success at this point? Success, my friends, is finally winning the battle against the snooze button to conquer the elusive free hotel breakfast. We'd missed it every single day prior, masters of the late start. But this morning, victory. And the spoils, cheese. Not just any cheese, mind you, but European Gouda, which possesses a certain comforting quality, like finding a $20 bill in last year's coat pocket, only tastier. Fueled by this dairy triumph, we faced the day's logistical gauntlet, packing and returning the rental car. Step 1 involved a trip to the gas station, an establishment apparently designed for unexpected social interactions. Needing fuel for pump 5, I confidently displayed 5 fingers to the attendant. He beamed, mistaking my signal for an invitation to engage in that most American of greetings, the high five. Not wishing to spark an international incident over refueling protocols, I slapped his offered palm with bewildered enthusiasm before clarifying my actual, far more mundane need for gasoline. He completed the transaction and handed me the receipt with the solemn declaration, "This is yours, not mine," as if sealing a pact forged in fossil fuels and mutual confusion. Next, we checked into the Octant Hotel, a place radiating a sort of stylish disarray. Dumping our luggage felt like stage managing a clown car evacuation, but we emerged relatively unscathed. Then came the final automotive act, returning the car. This required navigating streets seemingly designed by someone who resented the invention of the wheel. They were narrow. So narrow, in fact, you could probably pass a sandwich to the driver coming the other way. Were these streets laid out in the pre-car era, or just by urban planners with a cruel sense of humor? Calling ahead had secured permission to drop it at the main location instead of the airport, a small mercy. The rental office guys were remarkably chill, a stark contrast to the vehicular anxiety the city induced. They casually mentioned juggling about 150 cars during the high season, which instantly justified our off-season timing. No hordes of spring breakers, no wallet-gouging prices, just quiet streets, relatively speaking, and meals costing roughly what a decent dinner costs back home. Everything felt refreshingly reasonable. Seeing those calm rental agents manage their fleet somehow underscored the wisdom of avoiding the peak season chaos. We had the car back, the high five debt was settled, and maybe, just maybe, the rest of the trip would involve slightly wider roads. Holding the gas station receipt, still feeling the ghost of that unexpected slap, I tucked it away. A strange memento from a strange morning. Pivot point. Ponta Delgada's paradoxical prominence. Having successfully returned our rental car without requiring international diplomacy, unlike certain gas station encounters involving misinterpreted high fives, we ambled into Ponta Delgada proper. Some might seek tranquil island vibes after such ordeals. We apparently sought urban exploration fueled by the lingering satisfaction of finally conquering hotel breakfast cheese. We found ourselves in the main square, face to face with the formidable Igreja Matriz de São Sebastião Cathedral and nearby the famous Portas da Cidade archway. Before committing to culture, however, we answered the call of lunch at a Greek place that looked entirely competent. It probably was, except I possess a peculiar talent for sniffing out the single menu item destined for mediocrity. It was edible, sure, but in a way that makes you mourn the gyros not chosen. Service moved at the speed of continental drift, but complaining felt churlish. This was island time, after all, a concept invented to justify slow waiters. Ponta Delgada itself felt like a geographic eccentric, a distinctly European city apparently misplaced in the vast watery expanse of the Atlantic. The architecture immediately grabbed us, a stark, two-tone affair. Buildings rose from volcanic rock, dark and brooding, but highlighted with crisp white paint on corners and trim. The streets, paved with elaborate Portuguese stone mosaics, completed the effect. It looked as though a giant had obsessively tiled the city using only the black and white keys from 1,000 dismantled pianos. My silent wish was simple. A reliably good meal, a straightforward pleasure amidst the charming eccentricities of Azorean life. Standing sentinel in Gonçalo Velho Cabral Square were the Portas da Cidade, the city gates. 3 arches of the same black basalt, linked together and topped with a royal coat of arms. They looked rather permanent until a local guide offered some perspective. They were moved stone by stone in 1952. She explained nonchalantly, as if discussing where to put the new sofa, originally built in the 18th century near the harbour. I admired this deeply practical Azorean attitude toward civic monuments. While other cities fret about preserving original locations, Ponta Delgada apparently just picks up its landmarks and tries them out in different spots when the mood strikes, like rearranging garden gnomes for better curb appeal. Dominating the square was the Igreja Matriz de São Sebastião, its clock tower keeping watch. Construction finished in 1547, meaning this structure was standing long before the pilgrims even thought about booking their slightly less comfortable Atlantic crossing. Venturing inside, I discovered a building seemingly suffering from an identity crisis, or perhaps just a very long life. Gothic portals led into spaces adorned with Baroque gold leaf, while walls shimmered with classic Portuguese blue and white azulejo tiles. It wasn't messy, it felt like leafing through Portugal's architectural history, each century adding its own signature flourish. What does this eclectic mix signify? It signifies a church that's seen a lot and isn't afraid to wear its history, chapter by changing chapter. Paradise and Proxy Wars, My Atlantic Adventure in the Azores. History is merely gossip. Aproximadamente Oscar Wilde. Having absorbed Ponta Delgada's central square attractions, from its monument-moving tendencies to my own less-than-stellar culinary choices at that Greek place, we ambled towards the waterfront. There stood the Forte de São Brás, a star-shaped pile of 16th-century determination. It dates from an era when pirates weren't just charming Disney characters, but a genuine threat requiring hefty stone walls, presumably making civic planning meetings much more exciting. Today, those same walls, which once bristled with cannons aimed at unwelcome visitors, mostly serve to deflect the Atlantic breeze from tourists perfecting their pouts for selfies. A noble transition. The views of the harbour were undeniably spectacular, though I imagine the original occupants spent less time composing scenic shots and more time frantically scanning the horizon for incoming sails belonging to people uninterested in diplomatic niceties. Inside, the fort radiated a certain air of magnificent neglect. Green algae climbed sections of the walls like a slow, slimy siege, suggesting the place had witnessed its share of history and perhaps needed a good power washing. Wandering through its damp passages, it was hard not to think about the shelf life of empires. Portugal, once the Google of the seas, had its moment mapping the globe, only to be elbowed aside by the Spanish, then the Dutch, then the British. Now, here we are, enjoying the current season sponsored by the American Empire. History does seem to repeat itself, though usually with different hats. The fort now hosts the Military Museum of the Azores, a place where history felt less curated and more randomly accumulated. You could find weapons from World War II displayed near firearms that looked suspiciously like they belonged in a 1980s action movie. The first room threw me right into Portugal's colonial wars in Africa. Apparently, these nasty conflicts, fueled partly by Soviet AK-74s and RPKs, because the Cold War got its meddling fingers into everything, eventually helped topple the Portuguese dictatorship in the 70s. It was quite the chronological and geopolitical chop scotch. I came to the Azores expecting volcanoes that looked like geology textbooks and water the color of blue Curaçao. I did not anticipate tripping over a mostly forgotten piece of World War II history that made Portugal's staunch neutrality look rather flexible. These 9 volcanic specks, flung across the Atlantic like Poseidon lost his marbles, unexpectedly became critical real estate in a global conflict they desperately wanted to ignore. Portugal, under dictator António de Oliveira Salazar, performed a masterclass in wartime fence-sitting, officially declaring neutrality while presumably winking vigorously. This diplomatic tightrope act got interesting in 1943 when Salazar cut a deal with Britain. The Allies could use Azorean bases, an arrangement best described as neutrality with benefits. This wasn't pure altruism. It came after Winston Churchill dramatically pointed at the islands on a map and reportedly declared them the key to victory in the Atlantic, putting Salazar in a rather awkward spot. Can't exactly say no to Churchill when he's in that sort of mood. Evidence of this strategic importance was scattered amongst the older cannons and colonial gear back at the museum. The curator, seeing me squinting at a model of Lajes Field, ambled over. Before the Americans came, he offered with the air of someone revealing a local secret, that was just farmland. 3 months later, it was the largest airfield in the Atlantic. He said it like they'd just popped up a surprisingly large garden shed. Lajes Field on Terceira Island became the crown jewel of this Allied presence. Built with such frantic urgency, locals still talk about bulldozers working around the clock. It turned a chunk of volcanic farmland into a massive airbase. Aircraft based here could finally patrol the mid-Atlantic air gap. Previously a U-boat happy hunting ground. U-boats hunted Allied ships. Allied ships now hunted U-boats. It was a significant shift in fortunes. My grandmother says the Americans brought Coca-Cola and nylon stockings, chuckled Maria, serving lunch near the old base perimeter. But more importantly, they brought the range needed to kill submarines. She had a point. Priorities adjusted quickly in wartime. Once the Azores bases swung into action, German U-boat losses climbed steeply, and the Atlantic sea lanes became considerably less lethal for Allied shipping. The scale of the transformation was staggering. Lajes Field buzzed with 300 aircraft and thousands of personnel at its peak. Entire sections of Terceira effectively became American suburbs dropped onto a Portuguese island. New roads, power grids, and water systems sprang up, fundamentally altering the island's development path for decades to come. This wartime legacy is, unsurprisingly, a mixed bag for Azoreans. The bases meant jobs and modernization, but also brought cultural friction and environmental headaches. My grandfather said it was like watching the future arrive overnight, a shopkeeper told me wistfully. Some embraced it, others resented it. And here's the kicker, tucked away in a quiet museum display case, Operation Alacrity. This was the Allies' Plan B. If Salazar had refused access, they were prepared to take the islands by force. Documents detailing this near invasion now sit under glass, a quiet testament to how close this sleepy archipelago came to being dragged violently into the war. Salazar's last-minute agreement avoided what could have been a messy occupation. Perhaps that's the enduring story here. How a place, vital for wartime strategy, fades back into relative obscurity once the maps are redrawn. How the critical concerns of one era become historical footnotes for the next. The islands remain, weathered by wind and time. The human traumas play out upon them, fierce and fleeting. Fatal frontiers, freedom's ferocious fight. Staring at relics from Portugal's African adventures in that Azorean military museum got me thinking, particularly after pondering the island's own brush with World War II expediency. You see, after the global unpleasantness of the 1940s, most European powers took a long look at their distant possessions, filled with locals who weren't exactly sending thank you notes, and decided maybe running things from afar wasn't a growth industry. A sensible conclusion. Portugal, however, under the famously cheerful leadership of Salazar and then Caetano, zigged where others zagged. Their masterstroke. Declaring that places like Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau weren't colonies at all. Heavens, no. They were overseas provinces, integral parts of Portugal, just like the Algarve but with considerably more challenging wildlife and a distinct lack of enthusiasm for rule by Lisbon. This bit of semantic gymnastics went over about as well as you'd expect in Africa. Independence movements fired up by the idea of running their own affairs and conveniently armed by anyone looking to annoy the West. Soviets, Chinese, Cubans, never miss a party, began sprouting like stubborn weeds. Portugal's response was equally imaginative: send the army. Not exactly crack commandos, mind you. Think waves of teenagers pulled from farms and fishing boats, handed rubles, and shipped off to jungles they couldn't point to on a map, let alone navigate, to fight confusing wars against people they'd never met. It was a grim sort of 3-for-1 deal on conflict. In Angola, things kicked off in '61, quickly turning into a chaotic scramble between groups identified by acronyms MPLA, FNLA, UNITA, who often seemed to dislike each other nearly as much as they disliked the Portuguese. Over in Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral and his PAIGC proved alarmingly good at the whole guerrilla warfare thing, actually managing to control chunks of the country, which caused considerable frowning in Lisbon. Cabral got assassinated in '73, but the tide had already turned. Then there was Mozambique, where Frelimo started its fight in '64, met by Portuguese efforts that generated more hostility than success. Trying to hold on to these provinces was like trying to keep soap bubbles from popping, messy and ultimately futile. Back home, the whole affair was becoming a national bleeding ulcer. By the early '70s, defending these faraway patches of land was gobbling up something like a fifth of the entire national budget. Imagine telling taxpayers today that 21 cents of every tax dollar was going to keep Rhode Island Portuguese, assuming Rhode Island was hot, humid, and actively shooting back. Over 13 years, more than 800,000 Portuguese men were funneled into this meat grinder. Thousands died, tens of thousands were wounded, and countless others returned with scars you couldn't see. Young men began emigrating just to avoid the draft. The government, meanwhile, projected an image of serene control, whistling a jaunty tune as the foundations crumbled. Then the Carnation Revolution happened. More on that in a moment. Independence for the African territories followed after the fall of the dictatorship faster than a dropped tray. But if you expected tidy conclusions, history rarely obliges. Angola and Mozambique promptly slid into decades-long civil wars, becoming playgrounds for Cold War rivalries that killed millions. Portugal, for its part, faced a fresh challenge: the Retornados. About 500,000 Portuguese settlers and citizens suddenly arrived from Africa, many with nothing but the clothes they wore, landing in a country that felt foreign to them. They were the human cost of empire, unpacked and bewildered in the nation's own backyard. As the writer Antonio Lobo Antunes, himself a veteran of the Angolan War, later reflected on that period. What Salazar stitched together with the thick thread of obscurantism, the revolution then unpicked with clumsy fingers. Petals and power, Portugal's peaceful putsch. Having recently digested the rather grim tale of Portugal clinging to its African colonies like a barnacle to a battleship long, after everyone else had sailed away, I found myself in the Museu Militar dos Azores. Inside this stout old fort, appropriately named Forte de São Brás, was an exhibit explaining April 25, 1974. This wasn't just any Thursday, it was the day Portugal decided to have a revolution, but politely. Forget your pitchforks and guillotines, this one apparently involved carnations. The display outlined how officers, including some Azorians, finally got fed up with the dictatorship and those endless, draining colonial wars I'd just learned about back in Lisbon. It seems fighting thankless wars in Africa tends to sour the military on the folks running the show back home. Who knew? But the Portuguese approach to regime change was, shall we say, unique. Instead of storming the palace, they used flowers. My grandfather was there, a museum guide told us, nodding toward a black and white photo of tanks looking distinctly out of place on Lisbon's streets. He said people were so shocked to see tanks in the streets that morning. Then someone, a flower seller they say, put carnations in the soldiers' rifle barrels. By afternoon, everyone was doing it. A revolution sponsored by FTD Remarkable. Wandering through the exhibits, the backstory unfolded. They showed Portugal's costly obsession with holding on to Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Decades of fighting, bleeding resources, and young men created the perfect storm. Young officers, shipped off to fight unwinnable wars, came back changed, ready to rip up the old script. The guide pointed to a vintage radio, the kind your grandmother might have kept in the kitchen. The officers chose a folk song as their signal, he explained. Grandola Vila Morena played at 12:20 a.m. on April 25th. When the captains and majors heard it, they knew it was time. He pushed a button, and a simple, almost mournful tune filled the air. It seemed an awfully quiet way to start dismantling an empire. What really struck me was the neatness of it all. This wasn't a mob scene, it was planned with military precision, which I suppose makes sense coming from military men. The Armed Forces Movement, MFA, coordinated the takeover like clockwork. Yet nobody really fought back. Soldiers, many just kids doing their compulsory service, apparently agreed with the rebels and shrugged when ordered to defend the crumbling regime left behind by Salazar. For an American, revolutions involve powdered wigs and declarations, maybe some spirited tea-dumping. Portugal seemed to handle its regime change via radio waves and strategic shrugging. Within days, the dictatorship simply vanished. Almost immediately, Portugal held free elections, wrote a new constitution, and cut its African territories loose. An empire built over centuries evaporated in months. It seemed almost too easy, too clean. How does a country pull off a nearly bloodless coup, ditch an empire, and install democracy without descending into utter chaos? Among the displays of uniforms and maps sat something decidedly less peaceful, a flamethrower, just sitting there. There's a certain basic horror to a device built specifically to hose people down with liquid fire like a demonic garden sprayer. Seeing one up close felt profoundly weird after hearing about flowers in gun barrels. Stepping outside, the Azorian air felt fresh. We admired the boats bobbing in the harbour and noted a stoic World War I memorial nearby. Then, directly across the street, a splash of modern commerce, a gleaming dealership for BYD, a Chinese electric car company. I'd seen them flooding Southeast Asia, but here, across from a 16th century fort, it piqued my curiosity about import duties. A few steps later, another BYD sign. Apparently, they weren't just dipping a toe in the Azorean market. They were doing cannonballs, colonial history, a polite revolution, flamethrowers, and aggressive Chinese car sales. Ponta Delgada certainly kept you guessing. Ponta's pavements, past and present pace. Having just pondered the strategic placement of Chinese electric car dealerships practically leaning against a centuries-old fort, one might think our quota for observing jarring juxtapositions was met for the day. You might even ask, why are you still walking around looking at things? Fair question, because the sidewalks themselves demanded attention. They weren't mere concrete slabs, but elaborate mosaics painstakingly assembled from small, dark stones. We even saw the process live. A fellow knelt outside the cathedral, methodically placing a stone, whacking it firmly with a hammer, and reaching for the next. It looked simple enough, the kind of task you could do while listening to a podcast, but multiply that by kilometers of patterned walkways and the sheer labor-involved borders on the absurd. It's like building the Great Wall, but flatter, and with more potential for tripping. Our cultural itinerary next pointed us toward a museum known, bafflingly, for its taxidermy. Before confronting the main menagerie, however, we wandered into an annex. This side room offered a grab bag of local archaeological bits and the works of a neighborhood artist, a sort of cultural amuse-bouche, then into the Museu Carlos Machado proper. The first greeter was a great white shark, eternally suspended, looking simultaneously like a fearsome ocean predator and a creature mildly confused about how it ended up indoors. It had a certain derpy majesty. Nearby, a relief map detailed the island's volcanic pedigree, helpfully highlighting major blowouts like the 1439 event that restyled the North, and the 1444 eruption that gave Furnace its dramatic flair. This museum, the oldest in the Azores, set up shop in 1876 within the former convent of Santo André. Originally a natural history buff's paradise, it later branched out to embrace religious art and local life exhibits. As Dr. Carlos Machado himself might have noted around its founding, here the earth itself tells tales more ancient than any scripture written in cooled lava and patient stone. Seeing volcanic rock-sharing space with gilded relics felt profoundly Azorean, a civilization built on faith, fire, and presumably very sturdy foundations. The convent itself seemed less a place for quiet prayer and more like a medieval bank vault. Heavy iron bars crisscrossed windows and formidable nail-studded grills suggested security was paramount. We learned Holy Communion wafers were passed to the nuns through one such intimidating grill, because apparently nothing enhances spiritual nourishment like receiving it through hardware designed to repel invaders. More stuffed creatures followed, birds frozen mid-tweet, turtles contemplating eternity, and another shark whose nightmarish grimace seemed destined for internet fame. Sufficiently educated and slightly creeped out, we ambled back toward our hotel. There, a beacon of hope shimmered. A casino. A plan instantly formed in my mind, a foolproof strategy involving pure luck and wishful thinking, designed to recoup every cent spent on this vacation. Don't try this at home, kids. What really settled in about Ponta Delgada was how it managed to be historic without being hermetically sealed. Unlike some European towns that feel like carefully preserved movie sets, people actually live and work here. Cafes buzzed between ancient churches, shops sold useful things, and yes, there was that gleaming BYD dealership again, parked brazenly on 16th century cobblestones as if to say, "The past is nice, but have you seen our financing options?" Before executing my brilliant casino gambit, one final hurdle emerged. We had celebratory drinks, but no bottle opener. My wife, ever the pragmatist, turned to the oracle of YouTube. Moments later, she was demonstrating applied physics. Spoon positioned as lever, thumb as fulcrum, cap popped free. Science saves the day, or at least the evening drinks. Cheers to ingenuity learned online. As dusk settled, the harbour promenade came alive. Lights danced on the water and locals engaged in their paseo, the timeless evening stroll. A ritual played out against a backdrop blending old fortifications with modern conveniences. Our own stroll led us to a culinary puzzle, a sushi place, which upon closer inspection seemed closed, only to reveal it was now co-managed by the Indian restaurant next door. A merger perhaps born of necessity. My wife and I chose curry. My son stuck with sushi. Nearby, a German couple debated their options. The restaurant sat on a pier structure, doubling as a ferry terminal in summer for hops to neighbouring islands. Another reminder that this city is both a destination and a launching point. From the marina, boats head out seeking the 28 types of whales and dolphins found here, while Atlantico Line ferries stitch the archipelago together. The airport, named for Pope John Paul II's visit, connects São Miguel to mainland Europe and beyond. It's a surprisingly busy hub for an island mid-Atlantic. Ponta Delgada, I decided, wasn't wearing its history like a dusty costume. It was woven into the city's operational fabric. The past wasn't an exhibit. It was just downstairs next to the electric car charging stations, which reminded me I had some vacation funds to scientifically recover. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 7, Rifles to Roses, Ramparts Remember, where Ponta Delgada vividly showed how symbols of peace can emerge from periods of conflict. Next time we journey to Lisbon, confronting travel hurdles before exploring a city with millennia of history embedded in its very ground. Until then, thanks for listening to The Rise, the Limit.